Hey guys, it's me again. In this video, I'm going to show you how I set up archlinux in one of my old computer. I have a very old computer that's laying around that I haven't used much. I want to give it a new life by installing archlinux on it. So let's do that together, shall we? So in order to install archlinux, you need to have a bootable archlinux USB. I have another video that's showing how to create one if you don't know yet. I'm gonna include the link in the description. So once you have the USB, plug it into your computer and boot it up. So in my case, for my main board, I press F12 to get into the BIOS boot option, where I can select the USB to boot up. This is a very old computer, so it's still using BIOS. And in your case, it might be a different key, but the boot up screen, should show you what key to press. Or if it doesn't, you can look it up in the internet. But in my case, it's F12. So here you're gonna see the boot up screen where you can select the option to install archlinux. So I just go ahead and select the first option. So first of all, I want to check the list of devices available in this computer using the fdisk -l command, and the SDA is my SSD. So this old computer has one SSD which has 120 gigabytes, and the SDB is a USB drive, which is a 15 gigabyte drive. So I'm going to wipe out everything in the device SDA and start installing archlinux from scratch. So for this installation, I'm gonna follow the instruction that I recorded in the video how to install archlinux in VirtualBox, because majority of the steps are still the same, except two steps, which is, the first one is partitioning the drive and installing bootloader, because this is a very old computer. It doesn't support UEFI partitioning scheme. It still uses the old legacy MBR partitioning scheme. So I have to use a different command to do partitioning. Specifically, I'm going to use fdisk. But for the video installing archlinux in VirtualBox, because I enable UEFI, so I use the cgdisk command to do partitioning. And also for the bootloader, in the other video, I use a system boot loader, but system bootloader only support the GPT partition. So it doesn't work with this computer, again, because this computer is very old. So for this computer, I'm going to use a different bootloader, which is sys Linux, which we're gonna watch that together. So except those two steps, the rest of the steps are still the same. So I'm gonna include the link to the original the other video how to install archlinux in VirtualBox in the description as well, just for your reference. So as I mentioned, we're going to use fdisk to do partitioning. So you run the command fdisk and then specify the device. In my case, it's a SDA. You can press. So this is the console where which fdisk show to you, and the command m is for help. So we're gonna start with that. So there are a couple of things that we want to use here. So the command D for delete partition, we're gonna use that to delete existing partitions, and then we use the command N to add new partition. We also gonna use the command T to change a partition type, because I'm gonna create a swap partition as well. So we need to use that command to change the partition type for swap partition. We're gonna use the command A as well to toggle a bootable flag. This is required for installing sys Linux bootloader in the MBR partition scheme. So that's the high level highlight. Okay, so let's go through the process. So when you use the D command to delete partition, it's gonna ask for partition number. So default is 3. So I just simply press enter. It's gonna delete partition 3, and when you run the command D again, it's gonna select the partition number 2 by default. So again, press enter, is partition 2 deleted, and the same thing for partition 1. So now all the existing partitions have been deleted. So I'm going to create new partitions. I'll start using the command N. We're gonna select P for primary partition, and the first partition gonna be partition 1. So I'm going to create 3 partitions in total. The first one gonna be boot partition, the second one gonna be swap partition, and the last one gonna be root partition. First sector, we're gonna just press enter. So it's gonna start from the sector 2048. For the last sector, I want to give the first partition 1 GB inside. So the syntax is plus 1G. Okay, yes, for to confirm. Now again, we do the same thing for partition number 2. For partition number 2, which is a swap partition, I give it 20 GB. The formula that I use to determine the size of the swap partition is equivalent to, is equal to the size of RAM that you have plus square root of the RAM, and in my case I have 15 GB RAM. So plus square root of 15 is equal roughly 19 GB, but I round it up to 20 GB. By the way, this is the formula used by Ubuntu as well. So again, Y to confirm. Now I use the command T to change the type of the partition for the partition number 2, which is a swap partition. You can type L to list on partition type hexadecimal code. And as you can see from here, the type that I want to use is in is 82, which is Linux swap. So that's what we gonna use. Okay, so partition number 2 has been changed to Linux swap type. And now we're going to create the last partition. For the last sector, I just press enter so that it gives the rest of the storage or available space for the last partition. So we use the command P to print out the partition table so that you can check to make sure that everything looks good. So we have 3 partitions now: SDA1, SDA2, SDA3, and the first one is a boot partition with 1 GB size. The second one has 20 GB with the type in Linux swap, and the last one has the rest of available space. So we're going to use the command A to toggle the bootable flag, and the boot partition is the partition number 1 in my setup. So I'm gonna type 1 here. And to confirm that, you use a command P again. So as you can see, the SDA1 partition has a asterisk in the boot column, which is an indicator of a bootable partition. So the flag is turned on. And finally, we need to write our partition table to disk. So you type W, is gonna write to disk, and exit the F disk application. So once you have partition created, you need to make file system. There's one thing that we need to do here, which is a little bit special for this case, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna install syslinux bootloader to this computer, and bootloader syslinux bootloader only support 32-bit, and ext4 file system by default is it use 64-bit, so we need to turn it off. We need to turn off the 64-bit mode for syslinux to work properly. So you do that by passing in the parameter O, so -O, and then the caret and 64-bit. So this is gonna create the file system with 64-bit turn off. So this is for the boot partition. And then we make swap for the second partition, and we turn swap on. And for the last partition, we just create file system ext4 as usual. And next we're gonna mount those partitions. So we mount the root partition to the MNT location, and then you create a boot directory inside, and then you mount the SDA one, which is the boot partition, to the boot directory. To confirm, you run the command ls blk, so that you can see if your partitions are mounted properly or not. And then it's ready for us to install archlinux. So to install archlinux, we're gonna use parkstrap, and I'm gonna install the base, which is the archlinux base, syslinux, which is the bootloader we're gonna use, the official standard Linux kernel, Linux firmware, Intel U code, and also a few other applications that I'm going to use just for convenience, like ManDB man pages for the manual pages, and also sudo which gvim and git. I installed gvim because I want to use the clipboard feature. The Vim package doesn't have clipboard feature turned on, so that's why I use gvim. Let's go fast forward. Okay, so the installation is done. I mean, not done, but the base installation is done. So now we need to do some configuration. First, I'm gonna generate the fs tab file, which is gonna persist the partition and mounting points to the disk. So when I reboot the computer, it remember on the mount points that I just did earlier. And then we change root into the MNT. Change root basically to take you inside the archlinux installation that you just done. You're not running on top of the USB anymore. Now you're running inside the actual archlinux. So all the configuration that we're going to do here gonna affect the archlinux that you just installed. First of all, I'm gonna set my time zone. I set it to Los Angeles for my case, but for your case, I mean, if you live somewhere else, you need to set to a different time zone. And to see the list of available time zone, you use a list time zone command. It's gonna give you the list of all available time zone. To confirm that, you run the time date ctl, so you can see that the time zone is set properly. Next, we're gonna set the hardware clock. By default, it's gonna use the UTC time. And the next step is generating locale. I want to generate the two locale that I am going to use, which is a EN US UTF-8 and US ISO. So I uncomment those two lines and save the file. and then you run locale gen to generate locales. Next, I want to set the language to use the US UTF-8 permanently. I also set the key map for my keyboard to use a US keyboard layout, and I also give my computer a host name which is arch. And this step, I am configuring the host file for the basic setting, including the local host. And this step, I configure networking. For this computer, I use Ethernet cable. I don't use Wi-Fi, so for different configuration, you need to look up the systemd networkd manual page for more information. By the way, I use systemd networkd and systemd resolved as my network and DNS service. So here I'm configuring the networking for my Ethernet connection. So IP link show is gonna show you the list of network cards available in your computer, and then number 2, the ENP4S0, that is my Ethernet card, and the state is currently up. So you need to remember that name, whatever name of the network card that you have, and in my case is ENP. And in the network config file, in the match section, you specify the name expression. So it's ENP star because I don't care. Tell systemd that okay, match the network card with the name starting with ENP, and don't care about the rest of the name. I want to turn on the DHCP and also IPv6 privacy extension. And in this step, I configure the resolve for the systemd resolved service. I just go with the default setting, which is just simply create a symlink to the stub resolve config file that systemd already has. But for this file, for linking this file, you have to exit the archlinux, get back to the USB console, and then do the create the symlink from there. And then you can root back into your archlinux installation. In this step, I turn on the systemd networkd service, as well as the systemd resolved service, so that they auto start when I boot up the computer. So as I mentioned in beginning, so there are two major steps that are different from the video how to install archlinux in VirtualBox. The first one is creating partitions using fdisk, which we already seen, And the second step, which is different, that is installing bootloader. For this old computer, I cannot use the systemd bootloader, so I need to install a different bootloader, which is syslinux. So syslinux bootloader, it has an installer. However, the installer doesn't work for my computer because somehow it detects and install the GPT MBR file instead, and my system doesn't support GPT, but somehow the installer detect that. So so in order to resolve that, I'm going to install syslinux manually by specifying which file that I'm gonna install. So let me show you. So first, you need to copy all the C32 file to your boot syslinux directory, and then run the command extlinux install. This is gonna install the syslinux. Here I just run fdisk command again to check to make sure that the boot partition has a boot flag turned on, which we did earlier. We need to do this because syslinux require that. So now in this step, I'm going to install the syslinux MBR file to the boot syslinux location. So here I specify the file, which is the MBR bin, mbr.bin. As I explained earlier, the installer provided by syslinux somehow it detects and is incorrectly and is installed the gbt mbr.bin file, and that file will not boot up the system, at least in my case, because again, this is a very old computer. It doesn't support GPT partitioning scheme. So with this manual step, I specify which mbr.bin file to install. Okay, so that's it for installing syslinux. It's very simple. Now we're going to configure the syslinux config. So here I change the prompt from 0 to 1 because I want to display the boot up screen every single time. The timeout here is I think it's 0.1 second, so timeout 50 is equivalent to 5 seconds. Then you go down to the label arch. We modify the init rd to add the Intel UCO image, and then comma. So this is the comma delimited list, and you should not have space between them. So right after the Intel UCO.image, comma, and then it's / something something. So if you have a space between them, it's not gonna work. Okay, then you just save the config file. Next, I'm going to change the root password. I also create an user account for myself, and I assign that account to the wheel group. And here I'm going to edit a sudo to give my own account as a sudoer so that I can run sudo command. So you search and go to wheel. Because this is my personal computer, so I trade off convenience for security. So for running sudo, I don't require password, which is not considered as a secure setting, but for personal computer, I think it's worth it for that trade-off. Okay, so now you exit, unmount everything, and reboot the computer. There you go. This is the syslinux boot menu. So with all the option that we configure in that syslinux config file, so the first option, which is archlinux, gonna put up into the archlinux that you just installed. Bingo. So I have just done installing the very minimal archlinux in my very old computer. Okay, I'm done installing Arch Linux in my old computer. Now it just has been given a new life. It's ready to be used. So that's it for today. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.